Welcome to Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production all the way to release and reception. Today is a new movie, not a new to streaming movie, so it is my pick. Chris, what did you think when I picked Possessor by Brandon Cronenberg, the son of David Cronenberg?
Honestly, I was excited. The operative word is was in that statement. I was very fascinated by what the son of David Cronenberg could come up with. I haven't seen his first movie, but this one is getting even more buzz, I think, than Antiviral did back in 2012. And it's crazy that was 8 years ago. Yeah. And as we'll talk about on the show, as we trace the life of Possessor, this is kind of the ideal movie for this podcast, no matter what you think of it, because if you're gestating something for 7 years, plus you're the son of a famed auteur, it's almost too much hype. It's almost too much of a life for a movie. And then for, of all things, of all time periods, for that movie to finally be released, it's during a pandemic.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's get into it. Why did you choose this movie for us to dive into, Dan? And what is it about?
Yeah, so I think the intro here might be a little bit like how I got to this movie, might be a little bit long, but so I first came across this, obviously, I think Sundance earlier this year in January. Heard about it, thought it was interesting. I was kind of like, whatever. I'm not that big of a fan, or wasn't that big of a fan of David Cronenberg. I don't know why. I'm a huge, you are too, kind of a horror nerd. And David Cronenberg is like a king in that world, but I was never super into body horror because it always made me extremely uncomfortable. I just was never you gotta also keep in mind, we kind of came of age when Hostel was big and torture porn was big. So there is this history of body horror, kind of the cheap, shitty variety that we kind of grew up with in our 20s. And that stuff was huge. Hostel 1, Hostel 2, even Cabin Fever to some degree is a lot of body horror. So I had a very negative viewpoint of that subgenre of horror. And so I never really got super into David Cronenberg. But then, our good, I guess we could say he's a friend. Joe Bob Briggs over on Shudder. He did a 24-hour marathon, and one of the movies he picked was Rabid, which was an earlier David Cronenberg film. And, Joe Bob Briggs obviously is a horror show host, and he goes really nerdy in depth about movies that he showcases. And that one, it was just super intriguing when he talked about David Cronenberg and what he was trying to accomplish. Then I got into David Cronenberg movies, and I watched the classics like The Fly and Scanners and stuff like that. And then I came across, finally about 3 weeks ago, for whatever reason, I don't know why, Videodrome. And I was just like, I have to watch this. And I watched it, and I, as someone who studied literary theory, and I cannot believe that I have not worshipped David Cronenberg for the last 20 years of my life, because I saw Videodrome and I'm like, this is every postmodern theorist's wet dream of a movie, but it was made in the early 80s, right? That's insane. That he did that sort of stuff back then. So I don't know. I was just blown away by it. I'm obviously going to go on a weird David Cronenberg tear for the next couple of years. And so his son, I was interested in what his son was going to do. And I felt like there was a lot of movies to choose. Right. And I think you hit the nail on the head. This is a perfect Film Trace movie. It's new. It's from the son of a horror legend. It's just one of those exciting films that has a lot of buzz too. What went into this? How do they make this? And what is it all about? And does it mean anything? Is it important? Is it trash? We'll find out. And so that's why I picked it. There was a lot. I almost picked Mank, I was going to pick Mank, but I was like, do I want to talk about Mank? I don't. I don't want to talk about David Fincher. He's cool. I love him, but I don't really want to talk about him for an hour. And Mank,
and you almost did, right. And you also, speaking of boring, you almost picked Hillbilly Elegy as well.
Yeah. And then I watched the first 20 minutes of that, and I was like, I'm not doing this. There's this scene in there. We're going to go off track, but I don't care. There's a scene in Hillbilly Elegy where I stopped watching, where it's basically he's trying to show emotional drama through this kind of lesser off kid at like a private dining club where he doesn't know what fork to use. And like, that's the drama in the movie. I was like, this is ridiculous. People are dying of disease right now. Like, let's move on. And then I almost selected, what was the other one? Sound of Metal.
Oh, right. Yeah, I totally want to see that.
I put that down, but then I watched the trailer and I was like, this seems like a really good movie, but it doesn't seem that interesting to me at all. It just seems like a kind of a feel good, hey, let's overcome things, right? And I just didn't think there'd be a lot to talk about. So I think there's a lot to talk about with Possessor, right? And I think just the basic, I guess you would put this in sci-fi horror, which is kind of where his father comes from as well. The basic plot is this: in an alternate 2008, Tasia Voss is a corporate agent who uses brain implant technology to inhabit other people's bodies, driving them to commit assassinations for the benefit of the company. When something goes wrong on a routine job, she finds herself trapped inside a man whose identity threatens to obliterate her own. The premise is amazing. The premise is just like, if you're a sci-fi person, it's like, this is really, really, really fascinating and cool. And I don't know, like going into this, it sounded like you were pretty excited about it. What specifically excites you about this, either the trailer, the concept, or whatever was going on with this?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with the Cronenberg name for sure. I'm not sure
okay.
why I never got around to antiviral, but there is something about 2020 that is, I think, perfect for the son of the creator of Dead Ringers and Naked Lunch to kind of come into his own, so to speak.
Yeah.
And yeah, so like, I mean, my obsession with Cronenberg definitely goes back to TBS, the edits for TV of both Videodrome and The Dead Zone, which is still to this date, I think, one of the only good Stephen King adaptations for the screen.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and then also like getting into literature in high school and college. And so then, of course, Naked Lunch was huge.
Yeah.
The curiosity I had about his kind of very controversial 90s movies, Crash and Existence. But then, honestly, I don't think I really appreciated Cronenberg until he made his couplet of violence movies, The History of Violence and Eastern Promises in the mid 2000s. And it was just like, okay, this guy is like an important filmmaker. And so then when, the buzz started happening, as, you know, kind of ironically, as David Cronenberg is retreating, Dangerous Method was meh. And then I still haven't seen Cosmopolis or Maps to the Stars, his most two recent movies.
Yeah.
And then Brandon's star starts rising. And once again, like just the year that we're in of such absurdist tragedy it's perfect timing for this. And, you know, it's just like whenever you get a chance to see something on the fringes that is, you know, dangerous and, I mean, body horror itself as a genre is really something that you have to like take with a lot of grains of salt. If you're going to dive into it. And, you know, I was ready for it thinking like, you know, I hope, I really want to see, you know, what from David Cronenberg's oeuvre trickled down into his son's sensibilities. Yeah. But I was honestly, just to like put it out there at the front, vastly disappointed.
Oh man, this is been good.
I think you're right. I think there's tons of stuff to talk about.
Yeah.
But I think that there's usually two good reasons for that being a result. Either one, because there's so much substance there, or number two, because there's so much potential with so little actual substance there. And I think, unfortunately, this movie falls into that latter category.
No, absolutely. And I think a lot of the sort of negative criticism that we'll get into sort of talks about that sort of almost like throwing everything against the wall and see what's going to stick sort of mentality, which I think is a pretty somewhat fair assessment of the film itself. In terms of who made this thing, obviously Brandon Cronenberg, he wrote and directed it. He's 40 years old, son of David Cronenberg. We know him. Antiviral debuted 2012, Cannes Film Festival. I didn't really hear that much about it at all, to be honest with you. Antiviral. And so I think it landed with a little bit of a sort of a splash, but not massive. Not like this. This one's like a really big splash at Sundance. Producers here, not a ton of like well-known names. It's a kind of a small group of people here that made this. The producers also were like associate producers on Enemy, the Jake Gyllenhaal movie, which was pretty cool. They did some TV, Sensitive Skin. They also worked with Brandon on Antiviral. The bigger name here, Niv Fitchman, did the Red Violin back in the day. He's like the older producer. I'm pretty sure that he was like the guiding hand to some of this. Like, hey, these guys are young, probably not super experienced. Here's the guy that's going to sort of right the ship a little bit if something goes wrong. Kareem Hussein did the cinematography, which I think is just, I mean, if there's one thing that you get out of this movie, the look of it is just something to behold. Like, yes. I think that's immediately pulls you in with the poster and the trailer and stuff like that. There is a clear visual sense here that is unique and I think deep and rich. And so, we'll talk about the story and where that goes. But I think if you're just a fan of interesting cinematography, you will get something out of this movie. There's beautiful shots of when Toss like is melding with her victim essentially, or kind of her mark. Is it a victim? I don't even know what you would call it that. I guess it's her mark. Yeah. And those scenes they're gorgeous. It's some of the most fascinating cinematography I've seen all year and in the last couple of years. And, I think ultimately, the main cast here, Andrea Riseborough plays Tasia Voss. She's the main character who is essentially like the corporate hit person that takes over someone else's body and then does a hit, essentially. And then the person that she takes over obviously gets blamed for it. Christopher Abbott plays her main mark in the film, Colin Tate. He is the boyfriend of a CEO, daughter to the CEO of a huge corporation. And then also kind of main cast would be Jennifer Jason Leigh plays Toss's boss. I guess you call it Gerder is her name. And she kind of guides as the mentor to Toss going through these hits and these kills. And she eventually wants Toss to sort of take over the role that she has as the boss of this sort of, I guess you'd call it like a corporate hitman company. So I got a couple of key questions as going through the production details that we went through. Is this an indie film, would you say? Would you count this as an indie film?
Yeah, I was curious why you put that question in here. I think it's pretty clear cut. I guess the biggest question that we should probably address is nepotism.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Is that one of the key reasons why he was able to take 7.5 years to finally put this movie together and get it out there? I don't know. I think it's pretty clearly an indie film. The only question is, usually your typical indie movie is not given this type of timeline and is definitely not given this type of, like you mentioned, guiding hand. Yeah. It's very much seems like not only from his father, but from Niv Fitchman. I don't know if somebody without that name recognition would have been given so many lifelines and so many opportunities to, play with and experiment with practical effects, to eventually come up with something, 7.5 years later that ends up just basically going to streaming.
Yeah, I think, I guess the reason I asked that is kind of that, I guess the nepotism angle was why that sort of popped into my head. Does a movie like this get made outside the sort of shadow of David Cronenberg, who, let's be honest though, now I'm thinking about it, can he even get something made? Like, is someone going to throw him money? I think that's one of the weird, maybe fallacies that people have about the movie business, is that just because you made something great 10 years ago doesn't mean anybody's going to write you a check today. That's a common refrain that I've heard over and over again from filmmakers, even someone like Zach Braff, right, who got in huge trouble because he did like a Kickstarter thing for that one movie. And then I interview afterwards, he was like so despondent about it, because he was like, hey, like I couldn't get this movie made. No one will give me money to make this movie. And so like I decided to go this route and people shit all over me for it. So it's a weird dichotomy. I think but the point you bring up, there's two things that I want to bring up. One, there's no, I can't find a production budget on this. So that makes me think it was actually pretty high. Outside the normal sort of Blumhouse indie horror level in terms of production. And then also too, I think that like the long production time, like you said, a normal indie film has like 30 days to be made. Like they shoot it, they get it done, and then maybe do post-production for a couple of years. 7 years is a long time to make something. And so maybe he wasn't doing that the whole time, but like whatever. I think it's a weird, it's almost like an elevated indie, if that makes sense, because of the profile and stuff going on here. But interesting to think about that too, in terms of the production and stuff like that. So let's dive into some of the conception stuff. There's a lot. And I think what's hard about doing episodes of Film Trace about newer films, and we kind of ran into this a little bit with The Wolf of Snow Hollow, is that especially among smaller films, directors and cast, especially directors, get out in front of their movies and really promote them and do a ton of interviews. So if you're fascinated about why Cronenberg did whatever he did in the movie, I'm sure there's an answer somewhere on YouTube. What makes that hard is sort of like you're trying to pick out, with an older movie, it's easier to take disparate sources and create a picture that's kind of new. Here it's harder because you're inundated with opinions about the film and how they made it up front. And so a lot of the times we have to do is we have to take a, like what the director's saying. I don't know if that's always the best way to paint that picture, but that's the information that we have. I think a couple of things to sort of point out in the conception part of it. It does have an intellectual sort of basis here in a psychologist's work back in the 1970s. It was a Yale psychologist who basically used radio transmissions to control people. And his name was Jose Delgado. I guess he's famous. I'm not in psychology world, so I wouldn't know. But that's how Brandon Cronenberg sort of started this idea. The original conception of this movie was controlling somebody without them knowing it too. I think what's weird about that experiment is, so just the basic of the experiment, they'd basically fire an impulse into somebody's head and they would do something. The crazy part about it is that when they went back and asked the person why they did it, they filled in the gaps and made up a reason why they did it. So that's one of the key parts, I think, to this film and why he decided to do it the way. And a lot of the plot is that human beings tend to want to feel like they have causation when they don't always do that. And also another sort of, there's a huge neuroscience movement recently where people don't think we have free will. There's like all these books about it. So it's kind of in that world and discourse that's going on now about free will and neuroscience and neurobiology. And do we have the power to control our minds or don't we? So I think it dives right into that deep end of that discourse. And then Cronenberg brings up stuff like Russian interference in US elections and how people can basically be programmed via social media. So I think there's actually a huge chunk there that doesn't really dive into all that much into the movie in terms of social media manipulation. But that's definitely, I think, a part of this. And then he also talks about, I think, in terms of, how it really came to be and why he was inspired and sort of passionate about making this movie is kind of, I think he had almost a dissociative episode doing the press tour, I think, for Antiviral is what he said. And so he kind of felt like he wasn't himself and himself at the same time, kind of performing himself in interviews with press and stuff like that, which I think famous people kind of always go through. And so it's kind of a gumbo, right, of like different things going on here. From this conception stuff, Chris, like, is there anything that pops out to you that's sort of like, oh, that's fascinating, oh, that's interesting, where you can kind of see the spark of this movie?
Yeah, I mean, the Jose Delgado stuff is probably what's most interesting to me. It almost feels like now that we have been so far removed since he probably wrote the script, another weird detail that's kind of goes along with this, like the longevity of the gestational period here, is that it's set in an alternate 2008, but like why that year of all years, other than that's maybe when he wrote the first draft of the script.
Yeah.
And then it just brings me back to the question that I had as the film ended, which is like, I felt myself waiting for the allegory to click and like thinking for like, what are we going for? Especially because it's almost like not only in the subgenre of body horror, but in this kind of subgenre of, being stuck in somebody else's body. I mean, I think it might be interesting to do a double feature of this with that other new body swap movie, Freaky, that's out there.
Totally.
I mean, the other thing that it just made me think of is like all those other movies that I feel like have such a stickier, like more tangible correlation to what they're trying to say. Like being John Malkovich is about like performance and that act of like being another person. And Andrea Riseborough did the star of Possessor did an interview in which she talks about that. It's like one of the things that's maybe so appealing for an actor to be in a movie like this, because you could look at it as a parallel to the act of acting, right? Yeah. But it's so thin throughout because it's such a oddly, even though it's maximalist in many portions of it, it's overall a very kind of minimal. There's very little dialogue. If there is dialogue, it's very obtuse and abstract. And so it never clicked with me. And so the first thing that I saw when I Googled was his mention of the Russian election or the Russian interference in U.S. elections. And it just feels like that's such a diffuse connection to the overall concept that's played out in the movie, that it just feels like maybe he's just like, he's been spending so long on this. Like on the one hand, it's super admirable to like see somebody stick to their guns and follow through on something that's taken so long to put together. But the inevitable, double-edged sword, the downside of that is that you're going to end up having overthought it. And maybe he missed the mark, I think, in conveying that message to the audience without having to like go and dig through all the interviews like we've been doing. Yeah.
I think it brings up an interesting point about like, and kind of going into a little bit of the production, huge, long production time. You talk about like the cinematographer Hussein talks about how they came up with some of the shots. This is really nerdy stuff. Like this is like sitting in your apartment. This kind of makes me think of one of our friends just got a Prophet 5 synthesizer, and it kind of makes me think of like kind of just sitting there playing with a synthesizer, trying to make music, because we all make music, so that's kind of a door into the creative process that we have, and just sitting there and playing around with something for like days or hours or years, and like there is an insularity to that. And really diving into a piece of art that you're creating that can be extremely disconnecting between you and your audience. And I think that sort of aspect of this is a really fascinating one. Like, did Cronenberg and his group of people just become consumed by this movie and not really think about how an audience is going to interpret it? Are there like not really inside jokes, but like almost a vernacular that they had when making this that doesn't translate to other people? Because when you mentioned the Russian thing, that sounds like somebody to me who sees their work as very metaphorical and very sort of coming from all these disparate places in his mind and in his life and in experiences. And he sees that going into the product, but when you look at the final product, you as an outsider observer can't see the roots of it, right? You just see the leaves. Yeah. And so I wonder if that was kind of like one of the issues here that came across. I mean, over and over again, I would say on the negative side of the reviews, it just sounds like it's overstuffed. It's like too much substance and not enough substance at the same time. Right. And I guess one of the questions I'll have for you, because I think you're definitely more on the negative side of viewing this film and sort of its not value, but what it tries to accomplish here. It sounds like you think that it came up short. One of the things that sticks out to me as a question is like, do you feel like the cinematography, the sound, the editing, which I think is, pretty beautiful, do you think it has a weighty enough subject behind it to back that up?
That's an interesting thought experiment, because the other kind of connection I made while watching the movie is that it very much reminded me of Shane Carruth's Upstream Color.
Yes.
In the sense, right?
Yes.
That there's this intense beauty and serenity to a lot of the visuals, but then it's consistently interrupted by this like very disturbing and almost confusing, not nearly as abstract and obtuse as Upstream Color, but still like very much like just making you like it wants to probe questions as well as just like shock and disgust you at the same time. And whereas Carruth isn't too much interested in the body horror aspect, Cronenberg very much like wants to just like zero in on this. And there's some visuals in this movie like that it's almost tough to say that there are beautiful visuals because it's so counteracted by the really unsettling images in the film.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we'll keep going.
Just like I think like the thing that keeps coming back to me to use it as like an exemplar is like this consistent, even more than like the blood and guts and gore. Like I can deal with all that, whatever, but just the consistent recurring image of the protagonist putting a gun in their mouth.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that like that's how she taps out. That's how she returns to her own consciousness out of the avatar that she's controlling. But she finds herself unable to do that, as if, either she wants to be this other person or this other person's consciousness is fighting with her. It's kind of left open to interpretation for the viewer to figure that out. But just the fact that that's like one of the most recurring images in the movie just really made me it really honestly turned me off. And I'm not squeamish whatsoever. Like I said, like I thought Dead Ringers was one of the most unsettling movies, but it was also one of my favorite movies of the 80s. So like to see ultimately where that disconnect is, I think it comes down to something that Sheila O'Malley, reviewer for RogerEbert.com, said, which is that especially in a year like 2020, I feel like the thing that's missing here that isn't missing in his father's work is any kind of levity or humor. She says, sometimes humor is the best way to communicate really sharp ideas and concepts. Comedy can be sophisticated that way. It gets the job done quicker and more effectively than straight drama or tragedy. Possessor is humorless start to finish. Now, if you're going to have those kinds of moments of extremes, you have to cut it with something. And for me personally anyways, that's where like the beauty of the shots, of the music. By the way, the score is absolutely gorgeous. Yeah. I love, it's one of my favorite scores of the year, even if I didn't like the movie overall. Where I felt so like uncomfortable at the end, and not in a way where it made me think like maybe a movie like Da 5 Bloods did. There was lots of moments of discomfort in that film, but also once again, Spike Lee knows that he needs to undercut it with some playfulness, with some, black humor. And that's not there. I get nothing with this one. And so I just feel like kind of an empty shell at the end of it. I'm curious what your feeling was at the end of this movie.
Well, I kind of lump this into, the elevated horror style that came about, 2015. I'm thinking of like It Follows and The Witch, specifically like The Witch, where, I remember going to see that in the theater I think I saw it with a friend, and it's one of those movies, I think I got a C- cinema score. Audiences absolutely hated that movie, right? Because it wasn't a traditional horror movie at all. It was just a constant building dread. And at the end of it, spoiler alert, whatever, you should, if you haven't seen The Witch, you should not be listening to this podcast.
Go watch that instead.
Spend your time wisely. There's no relief in that movie. Zero. It Follows, there's a little bit of relief, but it's also this kind of incessant dread. But The Witch, I think, to me, is a prime example of a new movement in horror, I would say. And now it harkens back to stuff that you would have saw in the 70s, like the more naturalistic Texas Chainsaw Massacre. What else? Last House on the Left. I mean, some of those films are really disgusting, right? And another example I think I would sort of call out here is It Comes at Night, which is a movie that was totally mismarketed. But when you actually see it, is a dystopia thriller that reminded me a lot of films from the 70s, where you're left with this emptiness, where the vibe is the point. And the feeling of emptiness, I think, is what they're going for. Where there isn't a silver lining, there's no humor in It Comes at Night. There's no humor in The Witch, really.
Okay. I mean, I would push. It Comes at Night is a fair point. I think.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair example. I think Robert Eggers knows what he's doing. I think even though The Witch is definitely full of dread, like he's always playful with his, period piece dialogue, and also like Black Phillip is the star of that movie, and you have to have some kind of sense of humor. Yes, very dark, but still, like, there's this level of absurdity to the fact that, a possessed goat is one of the centerpieces of the movie. And also I'd say it follows still like somewhat dread, but like one of the main characters is still like the snarky side character, and she's reading Dostoevsky's The Idiot while they're getting killed off one by one.
Yeah.
So like, I'm not asking for a lot. I'm not asking for, a laugh riot. I'm asking for some kind of semblance of. Well,
I think it sounds like you want some sort of ironic detachment, like that's running through the film in and of itself. Which I totally get. Yeah, I mean, I get where you're coming from, and I get those points without a doubt. I just think, I don't necessarily buy that it needs that. To me, this is more about. The thing is, it's not even really a bludgeon, right? The vibe in and of itself, I think, is pretty nuanced. And how it oscillates different perspectives and different sort of emotional, I think, lenses that it presents to us. But you're right. Like, there's not really a lot of humor there whatsoever. I mean, there's a little bit of humor with that one guy, the plant inside the company, but it's not much.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think, kind of pulling back from that a little bit, going maybe cutting back over to the visuals and that part of it, because I think that's such a strong part of the film. With the intense gore, a lot of it was cut out, by the way. So one of the things you have to note here is that the movies, there's two different versions of the movie. There's uncut, and then there's the original. The original essentially is the R version that they had to cut for the MPAA down in the United States. And then the uncut version is the one that was released up in Canada at an 18A rating, or whatever the hell it is, that has more explicit sexuality, and the gore is a lot more graphic. Do you feel like the visceralness of those images is important here? Does it add something to what's going on, or is it gratuitous and sort of exploitative on some level?
Yeah, I mean, that's always a tricky question. I was just teaching about movie violence in the high school film studies class I teach, and I had a student bring up Deadpool, for instance, because trying to find those access points for teenagers, and because we felt like we had lots of good examples of purposeful violence on screen versus exploitative violence on screen, but like Deadpool, with just take out all the humor and just like the actual images of violence, it's super gratuitous, but it's also played for laughs. And then you look at something here and you compare it to maybe any of the movies that you mentioned, like It Comes at Night or even It Follows, which are nowhere near something like Possessor, by the way, right? And you have this really, and I think that's maybe once again where the sickness in my stomach kind of comes from, is that you've got this very modern, really empty existentialism vibe that they're trying to cut through, but also with that very exploitative vibe of like the 70s. And one of the things Cronenberg said in interviews is how much inspiration he gets from Argento movies, right? The giallo genre. Which is once again like a genre that is it so much of that exploitative violence, the entertainment value comes from the absurdity of it, the over the topness, right? Yeah. And so I feel like Brandon Cronenberg's like trying something different, also something different than what his father did, where he's trying to get at it. And there's a good quote, I forget if you had it in your notes or if I just read it, that actually helped me kind of understand his point of view of the purpose of violence in movies, right? Is that like he doesn't want to do the PG-13 thing where like people just get mowed down, and it basically feels empty. That to him that feels empty.
Yeah.
Whereas the point is to really make you sit and feel uncomfortable with the violence. And it that also brings back like the whole style of Harmony Korine, and I know we've argued maybe even on this podcast,
oh my God. Harmony Korine.
about Spring Breakers, right?
You mean the American masterpiece Spring Breakers? Wait, tell me what's your opinion on Spring Breakers? I forget.
Oh, I still haven't been able to get through it.
I mean, what do you hate about great art? Is the real
I don't know. I'm curious. Like, I think you helped me gain some perspective on this. Where the dread is the point, and then Cronenberg is adding to that by saying like the visceralness is the point. But there's really like I'm still struggling, and I love a lot of very serious movies, but I am still struggling to feel like fulfilled or like satisfied in any kind of way at the end of something like this.
Yeah. I think one thing that sticks out to me in terms, it's sort of related to what you're saying, and like the dread is the point. And I can't remember where, but it was an interview that he did, where he basically was like, and I think it actually goes into the reason why he said it in like alternative Toronto 2008, in the sense that like he's creating, how do I put this? This is gonna be difficult to explain in my head. It makes sense in my head. In terms of what he's doing, the plot is not the point of this movie, and the political context is not the point. He does that, I think, to sort of grab your attention, to pull in your awareness and keep you focused on what's happening. And the plot is, like you said, pretty light here. It's a really fascinating setup. And it plays out, right? It's not like nothing happens. It certainly plays out. But I think that's almost kind of secondary to the metaphor that Cronenberg wants to have you experience. And I think one of the things he says in an interview is basically like, this movie is not about necessarily identity or the rise of corporations and their power and controlling people, or late stage capitalism. I really think what he's doing here is sort of like writing a poem where the words can make sense, right? And they often do in a poem, right? Unless it's totally like crazy. But the feeling that you get is on top of the syntax of the words. In other words, essentially that the vibe of this film and what he's trying to elicit from the audience, it could happen without the plot being what it is. He wants you to feel something and attach it to these images, but it's not fully formed. That's what makes it the metaphor. He wants people to feel isolated, alienated. He wants to force that into people's faces. And like, that's why you use the body horror style to do that. Like when Cronenberg made Shiver and Rabid back in the 70s, he used sort of sexual transmitted diseases as sort of a metaphor for something. I don't know what it was. Probably late stage capitalism. Let's be honest. But I just think that here, I guess I love, first of all, I love this movie. Like, I think it's almost a masterpiece. And I've watched it 3 times now.
Oh my God.
And I'm not normally a body horror. I don't like gore for gore's sake. It's not my thing. But there's something here where it does, and I don't even know how to translate it really, but it seems like it's on a different level than a normal film. And maybe that's just my pretentiousness, or Cronenberg's pretentiousness being, or a chorus of pretentiousness with him and his filmmakers here. But it comes across as a special film and an important film, in a film that is trying to wrestle with things. It does not have an answer. It does not have a point. I think is really where Cronenberg is getting at. This film has no point, and that was intended for it to be that way. It's a metaphorical visual poem. Talk about fucking pretentious. And so I think that's where I latch onto it in a way that you're not, I don't think. And what is crazy about this is usually we have the reverse roles, right?
I was going to say,
usually I'm a genre purist who's obsessed with story, and you got to hit your freaking marks or it's not a good movie. And here I'm just,
don't break the rule. Brian McKee's rules of screenwriting.
Exactly. Where's Aaron Sorkin when you need him? Yeah. And I think that, but I'm also maybe an apologist for this genre too. Like sci-fi horror and this sort of stuff, I'm so much more willing to give leeway with experimentation. And I think that you're right. The story here is light. It's light. And the emotional backdrop of, the main character Toss is not super well built out. But I don't know. There's something here that I think is very meaty. But it's funny that you think the exact opposite. I love that. I mean, I think that's interesting to me that you don't feel like there's a lot of meat on the bones, and I think it's just meat. Right? I just think it's just like something to bite down on. Like every scene, there's something. I mean, we haven't even talked about Chris Abbott, who I think is amazing in this, and he's one of my favorite actors. I think he's so unheralded as a really good actor. What do you think about the performances overall? And maybe we talk about this kind of leeway into the release.
I mean, that is perhaps one thing that I think I had trouble with was that I just wanted to watch Andrea Riseborough. Yeah. And so every time she would disappear into Chris Abbott's avatar, I just wanted to go back.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, I think that's tough. I've been a big fan of hers. She's amazing in Nocturnal Animals. And I think that it's always difficult when you've got that kind of imbalance. But if you're super on board with both of them, then yeah, you're gonna find this fascinating. I don't know. I'm still struggling with the attraction that so many people have with Christopher Abbott. I don't dislike him, but he very much feels kind of serviceable at best.
Oh, you're gonna kill me. Dude, Chris Abbott's on screen, there's like an ocean in his eyes, man. It's amazing. I think he's a very good actor. But I even the girls, when he was in Girls and stuff like that, I was like, wow, there's something about this guy. It might just be physical attraction. Like, you don't know, you never know. What did critics think about this thing? Are they on board with me or you, Chris?
I mean, it's definitely like I said, I was excited because it's one of the better reviewed movies of the year.
Yeah.
It's definitely like, I mean, I don't know if you even want to mention the box office, but
yeah, it's kind of pointless, right? At this point,
I mean, it hasn't even broken 1 million. Obviously, pandemic times, but I do think that for better or worse, if you agree with Dan, Possessor's gonna go down for a while. It's 93% Rotten Tomatoes all critics, and top critics 97, actual scores of 78 and 77 respectively, and a 72 on Metacritic. So a distinct difference there, but if you compare it to the actual scores, pretty solid. Not necessarily top 10 of the year, but definitely probably top 30, top 40.
Yeah.
It's pretty impressive. Rotten Tomato audience score, though, that's where me and the plebes come in. 59% actual score of 64. Letterboxd 74. Obviously, you got that bump with the film Twitter nerds, and that maybe sometimes prefer style over substance. By the way, I'm all about movies that have style over substance. It's just not when the lead character is sticking a gun in their mouth every 15 minutes.
Yeah. Totally.
IMDb score of 64.
Not good.
No cinema score. I wish this movie had a cinema score because I would be very curious.
Let's guess what the cinema score would be. Let's assume normal conditions. Opens on 1,000 theaters, so not like a massive wide opening, but a wide enough opening where it's in most cities. What would you think that it pops off at?
I don't know. I don't think it'd be an F like The Turning, but I do think it'd be a solid D.
I think D+. I was going to say D+, because it's just like, this is not something this is not something you go into unless you know what you're getting yourself into. You know, it's like if you went on a really hard hike and didn't really want to, you end up like hiking 12 miles. Like, I think that's what people feel like in those movies. That's what I felt like in Mother, and I knew what I was getting into. Okay, so box office, not much to talk about. There is a split though between audiences and critics, and I think that's something to note. It's not an enjoyable film. There's nothing enjoyable about this film. Like, this is,
and that's what I need nowadays, Dan. I need enjoyment. The world is too bleak.
Of course, my favorite critic, Mark Kermode, the horror nerd himself on the BBC and the Guardian and the Observer, loves it. I think he points out too, like, Cronenberg's decision to shoot the special effects in camera, so it's all practical effects, to rely on prosthetics and practical effects rather than post hoc computer graphics play huge dividends. There's a real physical depth to Possessor that helps keep the story grounded, even during its most outlandish flights of fancy. I totally agree with him there. Give me some of the negative stuff, Chris. What do people
so I mentioned Sheila O'Malley. I love her, and her review is pretty on point. But Mick LaSalle, a guy you usually agree with, Dan.
Mick.
From San Francisco Chronicle, I also thought he had a good quote. He says, though the premise is more than promising, Cronenberg's screenplay lacks complication and variation in terms of actual story. There's not much here. The writer-director probably could have used the help of a co-writer to elaborate on what he had. Instead, Cronenberg just slows down and stretches everything out.
Yeah.
And once again, I'm all about slow cinema. Kelly Reichert's one of my faves.
Yeah, right.
But she has a warmth and a playfulness to her, even straight dramas that I just did not feel here at all. I will say, if there is one moment of comedy, but it's also played straight and I think works either way you cut it, just wait for the scene with the mask. It's wonderful.
Yeah,
it's
fantastic.
My favorite part of the movie.
It's terrifying.
And then last but not least, Orla Smith from the film stage. I'm not going to do this whole quote, but I think it comes down to, like, if it is beautiful, that's objective. She says, looks beautiful in a fucked up kind of way, but despite my visceral enjoyment of its visuals, I couldn't help but wonder what purpose they served. And that's where it comes down to. It felt like, as they were mentioning before, where they just basically got 4 years to do camera tests and play with things. And like, that's awesome. I wish the government could pay all of us, like Canada can, to spend some time just
that
messing with.
Awesome. They're probably like on the dole,
lenses.
like don't have any jobs. Dude, this sounds awesome. Let's move to Canada. This country sucks.
Right.
Oh man.
But then that's the downside, is that they just get in over their head. And so she finished her little diatribe by saying, these may seem like insignificant details, but it's indicative of the film's style over substance approach once again, which is also, I think, comes back to, we were mentioning Andrea Riseborough, and she was also in Mandy. And I think we had a similar split reaction to that.
Totally.
Amazing visuals.
Like,
but I felt so gross at the end of it, but it's one of your faves.
Oh, I love that movie. That movie's amazing. Just because, I mean, the story is trash. It doesn't even make any remote sense, that movie. Like, that's just like a fever dream. But the visuals are so gorgeous. I forgot she was in that. And I mean, maybe that's where there's a split. That's the split here, is that with Mandy, and I think with this film, to me, just the shots and the visuals and what those feelings invoke in me, to me is like weighty and important. Kind of knowing that the story is, obviously there's much more of a story here than there is in Mandy. But I think the visual experience and the sound experience, to me, doesn't have to make sense. It can be kind of a kaleidoscope. As long as the cool colors that I like come up, then I'm into it. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that, like, the caveat to this film is that like, I would never recommend this film to like 90% of the people that I know. And like, if my mom asked me about, like, hey, what'd you do in this, your podcast? I would basically say, oh, we did this David Cronenberg son film, Brandon Cronenberg, Possessor. Don't ever watch it. Is usually right. Kind of how I preface a lot of the stuff that I like with my family. Like, I wouldn't tell my sister to watch this. The only people in my life that would tell to watch this are people who are into horror movies, who just kind of love that world, get that world, and want to see crazy stuff. I have maybe a group of like 5 friends that I would tell about this. And I think there's something there. Like, it's not a film that you go to see because you're excited about like the story, or like you want to be fucked up after you watch this. And you have to be the type of person that wants to do that to yourself. And that's where it really, because I'll be honest, like some of the scenes here with the disassociation and stuff like that is, you know, as someone who suffers from mental illness, like a lot of people, to me, a lot of those shots are very, indicative and in harmony with some of the feelings that I've had in my life about identity and about anxiety and stuff like that, and feeling like you're not yourself. And to me, it really like captured a lot of that very well. But again, like I don't want to send someone on a bad trip. You know what I mean? Like right. I don't want to, and that's what this movie is. It's a bad trip. And if you really want to dive into it and not get a lot of story, then like you might be into it. But it's definitely kind of an acquired taste, I would say. I don't know. That's all I have to say about it. You have any closing thoughts about Brandon Cronenberg's Possessor?
No, I mean, I think the takeaway for me is, once again, like I am interested. I do want to kind of seek out antiviral, but I think I need to give myself a trigger warning for that movie and any other future ones from the Cronenberg family.
Yeah. Like when I saw Fly for the first time, I almost got physically ill. Like I almost threw up a couple of times. So it's one of those. It's in that family of movies. We're to our season finale. This was episode 9 of season 2. If you've been listening and following along, thank you so much. We appreciate your support. We have a season finale coming up here. What are we doing for it, Chris? It's your choice.
Right. It's my pick for the old movies. Not too old this time though. We're just shooting back 10 years, and we are coming up on the holidays. So I wanted to pick something that was new to streaming, that fit in that genre, but I gotta do a film trace twist on it. It's not gonna be your average holiday movie. If you haven't heard of it, I definitely recommend you seek it out. It's brand new to Shudder and Hulu. It's called Rare Exports: A Christmas Tale. Came back out in 2010 to vast critical acclaim. It's super strange, but it's a lot of fun. I think it's one of these weird movies that does have a lot of crossover appeal if you don't mind subtitles. It's from Finland. It's horror, fantasy, holiday, caper. I don't even know. There's so many different ways you could explain this movie, but it is a big fun time, and it might be one of the only podcasts out there doing a special holiday movie episode about this one of all choices out there.
Fantastic. Should be exciting. Thanks again for listening. This has been Film Trace.